Granoff Chapter 2, GASB 54 Fund Balance Classification, the Hierarchy Classification of Fund Balances. Fund balances of governmental type funds. This is limited to the 5 governmental funds: general, special revenue, capital project, debt service, and permanent. These are now to be reported based on a hierarchy in 5 different classifications. Only the fund balance reported on the balance sheet of governmental type funds is affected. It does not affect the reporting of net assets by proprietary or fiduciary funds. It also does not affect the reporting of net assets of governmental activities in the government-wide financial statements. Fund balance identified between non-spendable and spendable resources. Non-spendable, amounts that are not in a spendable form or need to be maintained intact. Spendable, the remaining balance, which is reported in the categories based on constraint. The next slide shows the marked up area of the balance sheet of governmental funds, which is impacted by this statement. You see that we have assets equal liabilities and deferred inflows and fund balance. Under fund balance, you see the 5 GASB Statement 54 classifications: non-spendable, restricted, committed, assigned, and unassigned, to achieve the total fund balance. So let's look at the level of constraints. Working from the bottom to the top, and remember now we're talking about the spendable. The bottom, no constraint. This represents unassigned. This would be available for current appropriations if the board or the elected body chose to, and for appropriations for the new budget period. As we move from no constraint to most constraint, we move up to assigned, then to committed, and we end up at the top. The most constraint is restricted. So let's look at restricted, the highest level of constraint. Spendable resources restricted includes amounts constrained to specific purposes by their providers through constitutional provision or by enabling legislation. Externally imposed constraints by creditors, bondholders, grant providers, contributors, or imposed through by law through constitution or enabling legislation. So you can see all of these represent externally imposed constraints. Enabling legislation allows the government to assess or mandate payments of resources and includes a legally enforceable requirement that the resources be used only for the specific purpose. The level of constraint on restricted fund balance is equivalent to the level of constraint on net position restricted in proprietary funds in government-wide statement of net position. So this is showing that there's some consistency in the language as we look at the financial statements for governmental, proprietary, and government-wide. Let's move down to a lower level of constraint, committed. The constraints are imposed by a formal action of the government's highest level of decision-making authority. The examples: the City Council committing funds for construction contract, rainy day funds, etc. So this is the highest level. These are the elected officials who make this formal action. These funds cannot be used for any other purpose unless the government removes or changes the specific use by taking the same formal action that originally imposed the constraint. Committed funds include contractual obligations for which resources in the fund have been specifically committed for use. And it's mentioned earlier, these include a rainy day or budget stabilization funds. In contrast to the fund balance that is restricted by enabling legislation, amounts in committed fund balance can be redeployed for other purposes with appropriate due process. We move to the next level of constraint, assigned. The government intends to use the funds for a specific purpose. Intent can be expressed by the governing body itself or another body that has been delegated the authority. In the general fund, assignment conveys the intended use is narrower than the general purposes. Fund balance in other governmental funds, except for the general, that is not restricted or committed is considered as assigned in those funds. In other words, it is the residual balance of these funds, not including the general fund. Note, the authority for making an assignment does not have to be made by the government's highest level of decision-making authority. Constraints imposed on assigned amounts can be more easily removed or modified than those classified as committed. So you see, as we've moved from restricted to committed to assigned, we are lowering the level of constraint. And keep this in mind, we're talking about the ability to spend resources. What type of constraint exists on these different resources? Now, the last level, the lowest level, no constraint, unassigned. This is the residual classification of the general fund. It includes amounts that are available for any purpose. Only the general fund can report this positive unassigned fund balance. For other governmental funds, the category is used to report only a negative fund balance when expenditures have exceeded the revenues. And I know that this is a complicated sentence, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on a negative fund balance in the special revenue, capital project, debt service, or a permanent fund. Let's work with other elements of the chapter and the text and not spend a lot of time on this because it should be a rare occurrence. Now here's a crosswalk. So we have the 5 governmental funds. I love this slide. And then the level of constraint. And non-spendable, these are amounts associated with long-term receivables that are restricted, committed, or assigned. For permanent funds, the corpus of gifts, which must be maintained in perpetuity, are designated non-spendable. And so we have the non-spendable that also includes some prepaids and inventory of supplies. Then we move into the levels: restricted, committed, assigned, a negative unassigned, a positive unassigned. Again, we're not going to focus on a negative unassigned because that should be a rare occurrence. But notice that only the general fund has the positive unassigned.